Hello and welcome along to another episode of My Football Story from the Honest Football Podcast. This week, Charlie's got something a little bit different as he speaks to Linfield Chairman Roy McGivern. A very different take this one as we move into the boardroom rather than the playing, the coaching, the media side, all of which we've covered before. We talk about Roy's passion for Linfield, a lifelong fan, his work at the club in previous roles as he worked his way up the non-football inside, and of course making it to the role of chairman. Roy was very honest with us about his role and we can't thank him enough for giving up his time to speak to us. So we hope you enjoy hearing something a little bit different. If you do, please do put a thumbs up on the video. You can keep up to date with all the other content across the channel by following us over on Twitter at HonestFootball3. But this is Roy McGivern's football story and we really hope you enjoy it.
And I'm delighted to say that Roy is joining us now. Roy, I really appreciate you giving up your time. I know it's obviously a busy time during the middle of the season, and also this evening you've already had various meetings and stuff. So thank you very much for joining us.
No problem at all. Glad to be here.
So what we'll do, Roy, is we'll talk about your role in Linfield, and you're actually the first chairman of any football club we've spoken to. So it'd be great to hear your sort of, what you do in terms of your role in the club. But just before we do that, what we do with every guest, regardless of their football background, is just try and sort of talk about your first ever football memory, really. You know, regardless of where you're on a football club, you must love the game. So, you know, what was your first memory, be it playing or watching, you know, as a kid, really?
Yeah, I mean, I probably grew up watching football from England, all the sort of big games on the telly, and I was a big Leeds fan. So that's my sort of early memories of football would be watching the great Leeds team of the sort of early 70s. But in terms of Linfield, I mean, I was born just maybe about half a mile away from the stadium at Windsor Park. So my grandfather would have been a huge Linfield fan. So he would have started taking me to games when I was about sort of 5, 6-year-old. So I remember walking up the games from his house, just really big crowds in those days, you know, the old stadium at Windsor Park, maybe crowds of maybe 20, 30,000 back then, which was big for Irish League football. And then just, you know, that became a regular occurrence every Saturday. It was just part of normal life then. You went to watch Linfield on a Saturday, and my grandfather took me all around the country watching the club home and away. So it just became part of my life. I did play a bit of football, but I always made sure the games were on a Saturday morning so I could go and watch Linfield in the afternoon.
What I wanted to sort of talk about then was how you've gone from that being that sort of fan to now being involved with the club. So how did that transition come about? You know, was it something you always wanted to do, or just sort of something that happened for you in terms of that?
Yeah, it sort of happened as a bit of a transition because I got involved with various supporters clubs. Back then, there had been about 60 supporters clubs right across the length and breadth of Northern Ireland. So I held various positions in some of the supporters clubs. Would have been organising events for players and testimonial events when players reach over 10 years at Linfield. So, and organising supporters end of the year functions, player of the year dinners. And then the club put out a request for some volunteers to help with some of the media work. So I started doing some work around the match day programme, writing articles. And then I suppose the sort of website was becoming more prominent in those days. So I started writing reports, match reports, and player interviews for the website, for the programme. That's something that I really enjoyed doing, you know, meeting with the players, talking to them, getting more involved in sort of match day around the club. And then after a few years doing that, I would have known most of the board members, and one of my friends who was on the board actually died quite suddenly. A guy called Frank Taylor, who was an institution at Linfield his whole life. He died suddenly, and I was asked would I take his place on the board and fill the vacancy. And I put my name forward, was elected, as Linfield is a members-based club. So we're basically run by our 600 members. So I got elected at my first meeting, and the rest is history.
In terms of that, just, you know, I'm not after personal details, but is it quite a tough balance to balance that with your sort of work as well? You know, like your 9 to 5, for the want of a better phrase.
Yeah, I suppose most directors in Irish League football would be in the same position. I mean, I'm a civil servant in my day job, so you do have that balancing act and making sure that, you know, your first priority is to your employer, and then you find then that most of your evenings and your weekends are taken up by football, and I think that's just the way it is, and most of our clubs are run on a sort of part-time basis. One of the things I've been doing since I came into the club is trying to make us more professional and to employ more professional staff who then would do most of the day-to-day running of the club. But at board level, yeah, I mean, all of our meetings would be in the evenings. I had a few tonight before I come on here, and that's when you have to try and fit in the work, you know, around your normal life and your normal day job.
So in terms of that, before we talk about you know, making that transition to being a chairman, I think one thing as a sort of a normal football fan we don't really understand is maybe the workings of what happens in these sort of board meetings and stuff. And I'm not after obviously any sort of juicy gossip or anything, but what sort of decisions are made at a board level that maybe, you know, us as fans from the outside might not know about, and how much influence, you know, does it have across the whole club, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose at board level, there's a whole range of things. I mean, at one level, you're sort of focused on the here and now. So what's happening on the pitch? What are the next games coming up? And I suppose the whole COVID, this year has brought a whole new dimension to it, that we've had a lot of focus on match day arrangements, how many fans can we get in, the stewarding operation, all of that, and how we sell tickets. And so there's a lot of it around that. But then there's the more strategic piece, I think, that, boards really need to spend a lot of time looking forward. How do you plan? What sort of budget do you have for your team going forward? What are your main income streams? How can you attract more sponsorship to the club? And then looking at, my really big passions around European football and how we grow the club, how we become more professional, how we then compete better at a European level. So if all those decisions, being taken at boardroom level, and I suppose we've tried to bring in more full-time staff in the club. So we've brought in a new general manager, Pat Fenlon, who's a guy who played for Linfield, but also has experience at a high level. He's manager of Hibernian in the Scottish Premier League. So he would deal now with a lot of the operations and the day-to-day stuff, which gives the board, I think, more time to look at the sort of strategy of the club going forward and how we improve at all levels.
Quite interesting to hear that side of it, because we don't sometimes, not with Linfield, but other fans get angry at the board, but we don't really know who or what you're getting angry at necessarily, do you? So it's quite interesting to hear how it's made up. Just in terms of that, we then sort of, you mentioned earlier about your main role now is obviously as the chairman. Just before we go into that sort of transition, if you don't mind me asking a slightly personal question, is it something you're nervous about? Because, as you mentioned earlier, Linfield's such a massive institution. It's such a, is there a bit of a pressure almost taking that step higher then, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's something that I never expected to happen, to be honest now. I mean, I had served maybe 3 or 4 years on the board, was enjoying my role at the club. We had a chairman there who was there for a long time and doing a very good job. So it's not something that I expected. And the previous chairman resigned fairly suddenly. So it's one of those ones, and it's quite strange. We have a big board. I think at that time we had probably 16 board members. Some are elected and some are lifelong trustees. And you sort of look around the table and think, who's going to take this role on? Because the vice chairman sort of had made it clear that he didn't want to take the role on. So there was probably no obvious successor. And maybe that sometimes clubs are not looking ahead in terms of succession planning. So the club went into a period, I suppose, of internal discussion. And I was approached by a number of people, and it all happened very, very quickly. And then about 4 weeks since the previous chairman left, then we had another board meeting, and my name was put forward, and it was unanimous then. That was very gratifying, that I had the confidence, I suppose, of my other board members. But it was a bit of a surprise. It was and something that I had to get used to very, very quickly, because you have that sort of initial honeymoon period, I suppose, where you get a lot of congratulations, but very, very quickly you have to get down to work. You realise the challenge of the role. It's okay being a board member, you're dealing with certain areas of the club, but as chairman, you have to have an oversight of the whole club, and you have people coming to you around a whole series of issues. So you have to see that bigger picture, and thankfully I had built good relations, right across the club. So it took me a while to settle in. It was a huge challenge, but I think now I'm almost 4 years into the job, and hopefully I'm doing most things right.
Just going back to that sort of early stage of when you became the chairman, obviously I think around that time Crusaders, I think, had won the league. Obviously, Linfield around that time maybe not quite where they wanted to be. What sort of changes did you make? How did it sort of change a little bit? Because obviously then since then, Linfield have then gone from strength to strength, and not just domestically, but also European-wise. So, I don't want you to reveal your magic sort of ingredient, but what sort of things did you maybe change? Any differences you made in that period, really?
I think I did say at my first annual general meeting of the club, of our members, I did say that I would make changes on and off the pitch. Working along with my board, I've done that. I thought off the pitch, we had big decisions to make. We needed to be more professional. We needed to get some key employees in to drive various aspects of the club, and I think we've done that. And that's a transition. You have to get advice on those things and to do things properly in terms of employment and recruitment. So we brought in a general manager. We also brought in a full-time head of recruitment and development. So someone who was able to work at all levels of the club, from our academy right through to the first team, to identify players that we want to bring to Linfield. So those were 2 really key appointments that I was involved in. So being more professional, I suppose, off the pitch, and then on the pitch, the challenge really was about how we move from being a part-time club. Some players who maybe it was their sole job was a footballer, others who had other occupations. So how we made the transition from a part-time club to a full-time club. And you mentioned Crusaders, and they're one club that have gone down that route. Since then, we've had other clubs. We've had investors who have put money into Larne Football Club, into Glentoran Football Club. So there are now maybe 3, 4 clubs. They're all going to be full-time, and I think that is making our league, much, much more competitive. I suppose from my point of view, it's really all about not only doing well domestically, but how can we progress in Europe? Because the rewards from European football now are just immense. I mean, we look quite jealously at our counterparts down south. We see Dundalk this year in the group stages of the Europa League, doing really, really well. I think that's where we aspire to be. So that was really on the pitch, I think, a process I started to get us towards a more full-time model. And we're still working on that. I mean, that hasn't happened overnight. But I would hope that certainly within the next few months, we'll be almost at that level where all of our players are training full-time.
I think it's very admirable of you to talk about that. I really appreciate you being so honest. And I suppose it maybe, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but does it feel like a bit of a risk almost doing that? What are the potential sort of pitfalls, maybe, I suppose, of that vision that you've got for the club?
There certainly are risks around it. Your financial risks are the obvious one, where if you're signing players on full-time contracts, there's an outlay there that maybe you didn't have before. So you're obviously looking at your sponsorship and all of your various income streams. But European football is key to our model, because we've had Champions League football now for the last 2 years. And we also have had the safety net of once we're knocked out of the Champions League, then we drop into the Europa League. And last year we had that tremendous run where we got right to the playoff game against Karabag. Very, very close, went out on away goals. So the incomes from that really have driven us on. That has given us the confidence and given us, I suppose, the financial stability at the club that we're able to then plan ahead for the next 2, 3, 4 years on a full-time basis. But it's important that we keep qualifying for Europe. And thankfully, we've managed, with our good run, to improve the league coefficient. So we will have 4 European places back instead of 3 we had previously. So I think that helps. But that has to be a continuous process of either getting into the Champions League or, if not, qualifying for the Europa League and then really trying to push ahead. And next year we have the added incentive of the Conference League, which is the 3rd European competition. So that will mean that there are more clubs from, I suppose, smaller countries getting through to the group stages, less qualifying rounds to have to go through to make it, because the rewards really for the group stages for an Irish League club would be huge and would probably set you up then for the next 5, 6 years.
If you don't mind me saying, do you find there's a bit of responsibility on not just you personally, but on the club's shoulders you mentioned that coefficiency and all of that, not just to obviously bring the success to obviously yourselves, but I suppose the whole league in a sense and the whole country domestically, do you feel that, or is that not really come into your sort of?
No, I think that's a huge responsibility. I mean, first and foremost, you're looking after your own club. You want to do well. You want your own club to progress, but you are conscious that that you have the weight of the league there as well, and it's not just Linfield. We've seen in recent years all of our teams have been doing better in Europe. I mean this year, Coleraine, for example, had a tremendous result beating Maribor. I think all of our clubs take that responsibility really, really seriously, because if you do well in Europe, then you're doing well for your own club coefficient, you're doing well for the league coefficient. And as I say, we've got those 4 places back, which are so important to the league. So I think it's important now that we all really kick on, because, listen, going back to when I first started getting involved in football, I think for many people, Europe was seen as an end-of-season reward. Clubs got the draw, maybe some of the players and staff as a jolly end of season, but really the results were poor. But now, since the financial rewards have become more apparent, and clubs can see that, really, if you're well prepared, and we've had better pre-seasons over the last couple of years. We've had players away on training camps in Spain, for example, just to try and improve their fitness, to give them the best possible opportunity to progress. And I think if you have that better preparation, give the players that opportunity, then I think they will reward the clubs and they will get better performances in Europe.
No, I think it's fascinating to hear that, and I suppose does that impact then at a board level at least? That you mentioned about recruitment and all of that kind of thing, not just playing staff, but across the whole club. Does that influence maybe the way that you would have done that? And also, how, if you don't mind me asking, just for us on the outside, how are those sort of decisions made? Does it need to be voted on? Is it sort of not necessarily an autocratic sort of approach, but how does it sort of work if you want to maybe bring in player A or just a different member of staff and that kind of thing?
Yeah, no, it's a fairly straightforward process at Linfield. I mean, we have a team committee, a small group of board members who work with the manager and with the head of recruitment. So it's quite a small group, and we're always planning ahead. You're always looking ahead to at least 2 transfer windows. So we would sit down and look at our budget, team budget for the year, so we know what it is, and then we start and plan what positions do we need to strengthen. And our head of recruitment then, has very, very good contacts. And I suppose maybe in previous years, clubs may have just looked at our own internal leagues in terms of the market for players, maybe down south, occasionally players from Scotland. But I think we're all looking much wider now. We've brought in some European players in in recent years with sort of mixed success. But we're always looking at all markets, because our club has probably got a higher profile now. When you're playing the Champions League, when you're playing against the likes of Legia Warsaw or Karabag or whoever, you're getting that higher profile. Players are noticing, Linfield as a club. Our ranking has improved. So I think we do have a bigger market now for players. But really it all comes down to budget at the end. You have to be able to fit players into your current budget. So whether it's players coming from other Irish League clubs or coming from leagues elsewhere. But we would take recommendations from our head of recruitment. But ultimately, the manager has to be satisfied that a player is going to fit into his team and fit into his squad. And then really it's up to the board just to sanction that. But the manager would really have the call, because he's in charge of team selection. He's in charge of all team matters. And the board's really just there to sort of give assurance to him that, that will fit into our sort of wider player budget.
Is part of that role also to mediate between the two? Because I suppose if there is a slight, not disagreement, maybe discrepancy between, say, what I'm only doing this hypothetically, what the manager thinks and, say, the head of recruitment, is that also part of your role to almost mediate between the two, or not really in that sense?
I wouldn't use the word mediate, but I mean, we have open and frank discussions about, because people have different opinions about players. And so that team committee is really there, that we have an open agenda, and people can bring names and bring suggestions forward. We've all watched local football for a long time. We know most of the players involved. People can put forward their views, and we'll come to a conclusion. But ultimately, I mean, if any manager wants a player in his team and it fits within his budget, there's not many boards would say no, because, he's the one accountable for performance on the pitch. And if things are not going well, and, ultimately it's the manager who gets sacked, unfortunately. So you have to give him that authority then to bring in the players that he wants, as long as it fits within your structures.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sort of talking about that. I think it's fascinating. It genuinely is fascinating for us sort of paying fans to hear that side of it. So we've spoken a lot about your sort of role and also the club up to this point, but sort of just wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the future now in terms of, your vision for the club. And you've obviously alluded to that already, but one thing I wanted to touch on, I suppose, what's come out of maybe this COVID outbreak recently is particularly on the BBC, there's been a lot more Irish League on the TV and things like that. Is that also part of that sort of scope to, not just on the pitch, but I suppose off the pitch, almost, I suppose branding and marketing would be the term, wouldn't it? But how does that sort of work, and what's the sort of plan for you with that?
Yeah, well, I think there's no doubt, as I said, that the league is becoming more visible in terms of Sky coverage and BBC coverage. It's becoming more competitive. There are more clubs doing well, moving to full time. We're doing better in European football. So all of that, I think, is very progressive. I think we can do so much more in terms of marketing and branding of the league. And COVID has sort of maybe halted us all a bit in terms of sponsorship, because I've noticed in the last few years we have been bringing in more income from sponsorship. People want to be, I suppose, associated with the Irish League as a brand and as a product. And I think there are huge opportunities there, maybe post-COVID. But I think there's more that clubs can do, and that was part of our role in bringing in a full-time general manager to look right across this island about, can we attract some of those big companies to sponsor our club and to invest in our club. But I think that television coverage has been really important. But again, I think some of the income from that probably is nowhere near what clubs in England and Scotland are getting from television income. So again, I think there's a real role there for clubs and for NIFL, which is our league body, really to try and take the league to a new level and trying to get really some television and sponsorship deals there which reflect the quality product that's now on offer. I mean, that's a challenge for everyone in these really difficult times. But I think there are sort of opportunities there. And you may have picked up even that there have been some discussions about in the future, should there be an all-island league here? We're quite a small island, but obviously two different jurisdictions. We have our own European qualifying places for teams north and south. So that's obviously one factor to take into account. But potentially in the future, that could be something that clubs could maybe see as potentially could generate more income than we're currently getting from our own domestic product.
Just in terms of you and sort of Linfield in that sense, obviously, hopefully, in your regard, like a record 55th title, and that would make it a world record, I believe, actually. Is that in the back of your mind in terms of planning, I suppose? Does that raise the profile a little bit as well? I know it seems a bit of an odd question, but it would technically be a world record. So, that is going to give you some exposure across the world, isn't it?
It's actually one of the opening lines in our new strategic plan, which I was meeting about earlier, which we're going to launch in the next couple of weeks. That's a 5-year plan for the club. And we touch on that issue right at the very start, where we say, our aspiration is to hold that world record of most domestic league titles. But I have to say, as someone who is quite fond of the blue half of Glasgow, I hope we're both on 55 titles at the end of the season, because they're obviously doing very well, and they're a club that I know very well, and we've played them on a number of occasions. But yes, I mean, as a club, Linfield want to be right out there. 54 titles is, I think, an incredible achievement for a club in the Irish League, and we want to go in 55. But listen, that'll not be easy. We were knocked off the top of the table there at the weekend, so that's just a reminder that our league is very, very competitive. There are other teams who are who are pushing for our crown, and that prize of winning the Irish League and getting into the Champions League is a huge prize. So there's probably 3, 4, 5 teams that are all capable of doing that. So it's up to us really now to push on, and we're looking towards January already in terms of a transfer window. What other business we may do to try and strengthen ahead of the second half of the season.
I don't want you to reveal all of your 5-year plan or anything like that, but before we sort of move on to the more quick fire questions at the end, where would you like to see? I know obviously you can't allow for pandemics and all of this kind of thing, but about revealing too much of it, where would you like to see the club in 5 years' time? And I know you've mentioned a few bits already, but maybe other bits that we haven't touched on.
I think certainly within 5 years, one of our major objectives is to progress a plan for a new training academy. We have identified a site in South Belfast, and we've done all of our planning around, planning permission from the council and development planning. So subject to funding, that's a 22-acre site we hope to have as a training site for our academy and for the whole club. We want to have a full-time club, certainly sooner rather than later. And I think within 5 years, I'd like to see the club in the group stages of one of the European competitions. If not Linfield, then some other Irish League club. I think that is that's an aspiration that we all should be chasing. I think it's realistic. I say we got very, very close 2 years ago. So that shows what is possible. And then I think we just need to push the club forward as far as we really can. Not just Linfield, there are other clubs in this league now who see the potential for this league, and they're all looking to push forward too. So that's a challenge for all of us now. It's so competitive.
One thing I want to say on a personal level, I think it's really fascinating to hear about your club and your role, and just the fact of being so progressive and so forward thinking. Because I think sometimes you can get bogged down in more media outlets, can't you, about sort of they're not putting enough into the club and all this, that, and the other. But it's great to hear that you and your sort of board are trying to push the club forward. And I know that's obviously a difficult thing. So I really appreciate you being so open about that. What we normally do, Roy, is we finish off with some sort of quick fire questions. Yours will be slightly different because you're the first chairman we've interviewed, so I do apologise if these are a little bit out there. But first one I wanted to ask you is a bit of a bizarre one, but I suppose is your favourite ground to go to in terms of your role? Because I suppose you must go to obviously as many games as you do, but maybe see it from a slightly different view as what I would from a fan who travels around Northern Ireland watching games as well. So what's your favourite ground as a chairman to go and watch football?
I'd probably say the Oval, which is Glentoran's ground, because it's somewhere that I went to as a kid watching Linfield. The atmosphere there, it's a big 2 derby game, Linfield, Glentoran, huge feelings between both sets of supporters. So the Oval is always one. I think there's always tension, big games, huge results there. So that's probably my favourite away ground.
It's the only negative question I'll hopefully ask you today, but you don't have to go into any details, but what's the least rewarding part of maybe being, or not least rewarding, but what's the hardest part of being a chairman of a football club?
The hardest part is probably having to give bad news to people. So whether that's a player who's leaving the club, whether it's an employee who's leaving the club, whether you're banning a supporter, sometimes they're difficult decisions that need made at football clubs sometimes, and usually the chairman as the person has to deliver the bad news. So I say normally as a player, if you have to say after so many years you're moving on, or so that's always difficult. But you try and keep a good relationship with people, and it's always done for the right reasons.
That's fascinating. I genuinely didn't realise it. I suppose it was under your sort of remit to let a player know that he wouldn't be part of the. I just assumed from the outside it'd be a manager. That's quite interesting to hear.
It might be a joint discussion sometimes. Sometimes be myself and the manager, but it's one of those decisions in football that you have to take.
No, of course. And actually, it's probably, although it's a positive question, maybe a difficult sort of thing to answer. But what's the most rewarding part of being a chairman? If you had to nail it down to one sort of thing, if you could.
I think there's no doubt for me, it's bringing success to the club and seeing supporters what it means to them. I'll never forget my first league title win as chairman. We won the league at Solitude, which is in North Belfast. Brought the trophy back to Windsor Park, and we had a number of thousands of fans there who couldn't get to the game. We were back in the ground waiting, and just to see the sheer delight on people's faces, bringing success to the club, that's so rewarding for everyone.
I suppose it seems a bit of an obvious answer, but I suppose it's still that's a massive reflection on the job you're doing as chairman. And then the last question, Roy, I don't want to take out any more of your evening, but the last question, we actually started this series as asking people about just fans about their favourite football match. But obviously because of your work in the club, so we're going to ask you sort of your favourite football match as maybe Linfield chairman, so in your time as a chairman, but then just your favourite football match as a fan. So it doesn't necessarily be a Linfield one, it could be any game that you watched on TV, at the ground, anything really. Well,
chairman would say, I would go back to that game at Solitude where we were 1-0 down at half time, had to win the league, won the game 3-1. Our well-known striker Andy Waterworth scored a second half hat-trick, but I'll never forget the emotions at half time, being behind. Our nearest rivals, Crusaders, were winning, so they were top of the league. Last game of the season, you normally have some half-time boardroom hospitality, cup of tea. I couldn't even drink a cup of tea. I couldn't hold the cup. So my stomach was in knots. Just the sheer emotion of it all, and the dread, the feeling of we're going to throw this away. but the players come out, won the second half 3-1, and just the euphoria of the aftermath of that game will live with me for a long, long time.
What would be your sort of favourite game as a fan then, outside of your role?
Probably 2006. We won the Irish Cup final against Glentoran at Windsor Park. It was a season that we won what's called a clean sweep. The cup final was the last game of the season to win all of the domestic trophies. So it's happened twice before in the club's history, both before my time. That the last one was 1961-62. So the first time that I would have seen it as a fan. And Glentoran had quite a good record against us in Irish Cup finals. So a lot of pressure on the team that day. But again, we went behind and came back to win 2-1. Peter Thompson scored 2 goals. So the feeling that day to win the clean sweep, to beat your biggest rivals at Windsor Park was just unbelievable. So that's probably my best feeling ever as a Linfield fan.
Roy, it's been 2 great games to finish on as well. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate you doing that and giving up your time. I know it's obviously busy for you.
Charlie, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity, and good to talk to you.